This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
You debugged in your head. It wasn't sitting at the machine, single-stepping and doing breakpoints. You looked at, if you had a problem, you thought it out. Why is this happening? Working on the hardware kind of only as necessary.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Harry Stewart was a contractor for Atari from August 1978 through October 1983. He contributed to the operating system design and the manuals for the Atari 400 and 800, created the Atari implementation of the WSFN language, which was released in the first Atari Program Exchange catalog, summer 1981. He created Atari's Pilot programming language and the unreleased sequel, Super Pilot, also known as Summer Camp Pilot. Harry saved an enormous amount of material, source code, memos, notes, and more. He scanned some of it, I scanned some of it, and it's online at the Internet Archive and the AtariAge forums. Check the show notes at ataripodcast.com for those links. This interview took place on June 29, 2017.
Well, when I was in college, I had started out to be, initially I thought I might go into mathematics and found out fairly quickly that I really didn't have the skills for that. Mm-hmm. And decided engineering would be a good place then to go with, my mathematical interest. And ended up, and I've also been tinkering around with electrical stuff, magnets and not very serious stuff, but I decided to go into electrical engineering. And so part of that allowed me to get into a couple of courses involving computers. There was kind of an introductory course where we worked on a Burroughs machine with a language called Balgol, which was kind of Burroughs' version of Algol. And then got into a couple more courses, one where we were working with an assembler, but as I recall, we didn't really assemble the code, but we were given like a virtual machine definition, mm-hmm. which had opcodes and addresses and things, and so I kind of learned the concepts of assembler. And then there was a third class which involved design. It was more of a hardware class involving design of digital computers, and that stuff really piqued my interest. But at the time, Stanford didn't offer a bachelor's degree in anything involving computers. So I took those three courses, and because that's really interesting. I really feel like I have an affinity for this, but, I'm a double E. And so my first job was with Douglas Aircraft. I ended up moving down to Southern California from the Bay Area. And I worked as an engineer for a while, about 6 months. And it was kind of a little disappointing because I was working with relays and stuff like that on some of their rocketry. I think it had to do maybe with the Thor Delta mm-hmm. rocket. And I got a chance, one of my college roommates was working also down there at Douglas, and he was in the Apollo program. Douglas had a contract to work for the S-4B stage of the Apollo. He said, we need people. Are you interested? And this would be in the area of software programming. And I said, oh my gosh, am I ever. I'm really not thriving here where I am, and I just love to get into that. And so I transferred over into this missiles in space, and they had a whole bunch of us. And this is, you're going back to about 1962, 1963. Mm-hmm. And there were a bunch of us who went into a training class, and of course nobody had any education involving this, so it was just assumed that they're looking for people who had aptitude. So there was like an English major, there was a history major, and I was probably one of the better qualifieds in a sense, and they trained us programming on a 7090, IBM 7090. And, of course, this was all batch operation there, right? We would put things on coding sheets, have them key punch, submit the job. Next morning, you'd get back a computer printout. And that's how we did our programming. And so from there, then I ended up being on this program for the S4B, and what we were doing was developing software to test fire the stage up in Sacramento. They had test stands. Mm-hmm. They're out by Rancho Cordova, and they would actually put these things in these test stands and fuel them up and fire them, but under computer control with human backup. And what I had done for them was to work on the I/O subsystem for a magnetic tape-based operating system. And so that was kind of my introduction to programming, was writing the I/O subsystem for this operating system. And worked there for a while, decided, yes, this is really what I want to do. I want to do programming. And so stayed with that for a while, mm-hmm. A long while, as it turned out, the rest of my career, 40 years worth. And when the microprocessors got introduced in like mid-1970s, Intel 8080 specifically, I was in a company that was doing some interesting work with document storage and retrieval, and that's where I kind of got my introduction to microprocessors via the 8080. And I did some work for that, and that I said, this really is what I want to do. And so then from then on in my career, pretty much I stuck with developing software and firmware for various types of microprocessors, Intel family, Motorola, a lot of work with them, Microchip. And so I ended up doing a lot of work for handheld devices and things for like Logitech and under contract. I became a consultant in 1970 and pretty much did consulting work mm-hmm. For the rest of my career. I had a couple of very brief periods of employment, direct employment, but mostly it was consulting work. And Atari was part of that. I was a consultant while at Atari. And had my own computer at that point, which was just my dream, from back when it first seemed to become a feasible thing to do. When the mini computers came out and you had like the Honeywell 300 and things, I said, gee, maybe someday I'll own a computer. And of course the PDP-8. And I got a chance to own one when I was working for a company called Millennium Information Systems, and they developed mm-hmm. An emulator system, one of those where you would plug in a pod in place of a processor and actually do hardware emulation and being able to single step and monitor and set breakpoints and things in processors. And I had a chance to buy one of those and did so. And it had an operating system for it called UDOS, which I had been indirectly involved with the development of that. Not a major part, but a small part of that. And so I knew the product pretty well and said, well, this is great. I'm going to get a Lear-Sigler ADM3 terminal, and I got this computer, and it comes with these, what were they, 10-inch floppy disks. And gosh, I can do real programming on my own. And actually ended up porting with another person. We ported UCSD Pascal onto that product. And hoped to make some money on it. We made enough we didn't lose money, let's put it that way. We didn't sell a lot of them. But at that point, then I had not only this UDOS running on the machine, but I also had UCSD Pascal. And so I had a Pascal compiler, I had a couple of different editors, and a fair amount of capability. And then I added on let's see who made that. It's a daisy wheel printer. Diablo daisy wheel printer.
Mm-hmm.
Added one of those, so I was able to make very nice quality documentation with that. And so then I was kind of, started to get into where I could do some pretty good tech writing, which I enjoyed. And that was right about the time where I got involved with Atari, which I can get into, or if you want to know more about my career.
No, that's great background. Let's start about your time contracting for Atari. How do you remember how you got involved with them, or were you interviewed?
I do.
Tell me the story.
Yeah, I had sent them I lived in Los Gatos at the time, and Atari had a there initially was in Los Gatos, and I had sent them just a letter, informing them that I was available to do consulting work. I knew microprocessors and wondered if they would be interested. And got back no response whatsoever. Well, I didn't pursue it. It turns out it was a very busy time for me in doing microprocessor work, so I didn't pursue that. But I got a call, probably 1978, from George Simcock, who was a manager there on the home computer division at Atari, and he and I had worked on together in a couple of different companies prior to that. Computer Sciences Corporation, which was doing contract work for NASA at the time, NASA Ames in Mountain View. And then we had also worked together at a company called Transifile, which we had, and so we knew each other pretty well. And that like I say, by 1978, he had been a manager at Atari, and he gave me a call and wanted to know if I wanted to come in and do some work at Atari. And I said, yeah, it really sounded pretty good. I had a fair amount of availability, and it'd be pretty exciting, I thought, working at Atari. So I went there. And I think that the reason he had called me was that I had maybe a certain maturity that he was looking for. There were a bunch of kids at Atari coming from, primarily gaming, and he knew I had a lot of operating system experience and was able to write documents about things, and add inputs for design. And so he called me in to perform those functions. So at the time, the operating system was being developed by Larry Kaplan and David Crane, Al Miller, Bob Whitehead. They were primarily responsible for the OS. And it was a matter of trying to find out what they were doing. They weren't really big into documentation, but they were really prolific coders. Mm-hmm. And so they were cranking it out, and I think, part of my function was to kind of see what the heck they were doing and if I had any inputs to get those in. So, it's all kind of vague as to really what was going on a day-to-day basis, but I can remember also working, Scott Scheinman was also involved, and I remember one of his big inputs was working on what they called the ASCII character set, mm-hmm. which was much like ASCII as far as the alphabetic characters and the special characters, but then there were a lot of gaps in ASCII, and those were being filled in with a lot of special symbols. And I remember Scott and whoever he was working with spent a lot of time trying to figure out what those special symbols could be to give them the most utility for other application and game development. Like 4 of the characters were the 4 suits of a standard mm-hmm. card deck. Sure. And all kinds of things like that. And things for framing, vertical lines and corners and horizontal lines. And so we're working on that. And did you have input on the character set? Well, I don't think I did. I figured, I didn't have a whole lot to add, and I just kind of let that evolve, and I think Scott did a good job on that. Yeah. The people who worked with that.
All right, so you're there and they're working on the OS, and you're kind of get your bearings on that. So how were you, what did you do with it? What did you contribute? How did you help?
Well, I noticed in looking over some documentation I have that apparently I got involved with the hard drive, although I have no direct recollection of that. It's kind of interesting. There's a number of cases of that where I'm seeing documents I wrote that I have no memory of doing them, but there they are. And, it's obvious. It's got my company name and my name and all these things and these external specs and things like that. So apparently I was involved with that.
Do you mean floppy drive, or was there a hard drive in the works that early?
No, this was a floppy drive.
Okay.
What was it? The 810, is it?
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can remember that there was something going on, and I don't remember exactly what, but some kind of problem that evolved in writing the driver, and I went over and talked to Niles Stroll in engineering, and I don't remember exactly what the problem was, but I think it was a very minor change we wanted. I think there was some kind of maybe a glitch or an intermittent problem that could be easily fixed by adding something like a resistor or perhaps a diode or something about a pin in a connector, and going over to Niles Stroll and saying, you could really make this thing more reliable and a lot easier to use if you would just add this, whatever this component was. And I can remember him telling me that, well, this was going to cost, in my mind it's a penny, but perhaps it was a dime. But whatever it was totally outrageous when you look at the number of units that were going to be manufactured, and that we could just live with this problem. That totally impractical to spend a penny or a dime or whatever it was more per unit. So I stopped going to engineering at that point with suggested improvements.
Fix it in software, right?
Fix it in software.
Yikes.
So at some point in time, I, like I said, I was doing documentation, doing some design change, and I guess the next thing that happened, I've got kind of a timeline here. And I guess the next thing that happened was that I had read an article in Dr. Dobbs' journal about this robot control language written by what was his name? Well, his name escapes me right now. But the language was WSFN, which was kind of a tongue-in-cheek, and that means which stands for nothing. Mm-hmm. So he's made up this acronym, which stands for nothing. And but the robot control language was very, very simple, a very elegant design. And this was on my time, not on Atari's time. I decided to, in fact, it may have even preceded Atari. I implemented this on my computer, on my development system with 8080. The development system had two processors, a Signetics 2650, which ran the operating system, but it also had an 8080, which was used to control, which was the emulator, or maybe a Z80, which is, of course, 8080 compatible, 8080 superset. And so I took and just, pretty much byte for byte, except for the I/O portions, put this WSFN running on my machine with this ADM3, which was just a character terminal. And so I did, very primitive implementation and got pretty excited about it. And so, when I was at Atari, I decided this might make an interesting product. And so I ported that over for the 6502, and using the standard Atari OS calls. Didn't attempt to do anything really dramatic. Any chance I could use the operating system, I did. Rather than doing anything for efficiency or from speed. Mm-hmm. And got that running, and actually spent a fair amount of time with this, with the company's blessing. But then it got pretty much completed. It became apparent to everybody that this was not really going to become a product. We had a disk version, we had a cartridge version, and it ended up going to APX.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just difficult. I mean, very limited market. It was a terse language, very hard to read. A lot of fun. Just the architecture was a really interesting language, but kind of one of those write-only languages. You wrote your program and then heaven help you if you wanted to go back and figure out what it did later.
Right. So, was it disappointing for it to be put into the APX?
Well, I think it was at the time. You know, I looking back, oh, absolutely, I can, because I can't understand anything I wrote in the language now, and the documentation was really inadequate, and I was kind of could write the technical specs, you know, the syntax and the grammar and all that. I could get that down, but didn't do a very good job of explaining to a potential user how things about it. That was not my forte. I was more of a tech writer.
Yeah.
Never really did very well with user manuals. But, well, speaking of that, about that time, the following year, 1979.
Before we move on, I just want to know:
Sure.
did WSFN did it sell? I mean, was there any interest, or how did it do?
Well, you know, I have no idea. I think I got some royalties from APX, so they must have sold a few.
All right.
And I think that may have been my only APX submission. And I might have gotten a letter or two. I did, in fact, or an article or two about it, with people who like it because of its direct interface. Just as you type, things happen on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you could. It was a turtle graphics language, and although the rotation was at 45-degree increments, pretty easy to use. And you type forward, and this little dot would move forward on the screen and draw, or you could make it go forward any number of units you wanted to, and then turn and draw some more. So it was very, at one level. The interactive level, it was quite easy to use and gave you immediate feedback. At the level it was probably harder to understand was when you attempted to write a program with it, or a long sequence.
Mm-hmm.
But I think some people really appreciated the fact that they could give this to a child and they could immediately just kind of do things.
Sure.
As far as to how many units they sold, I have no idea.
Okay. And yes, that was your only APX program. So I interrupted you before you were going to go ahead to something the next year.
Yeah. Anyway, that did get my interest going in turtle graphics, which we'll play into later. But the next thing I did at Atari was I was approached by. Let's see. At this point, George Simcock had left the company. And I think John Powers was now managing the group, the OS, and he wanted to know if I wanted to write the user manual, or not the user manual, what would you call it? The description of the operating system.
Mm-hmm.
All the I/O calls and the various things you could do, the variables, pretty much a complete document describing the source code, which was going to be used for given to developers. So I was very much interested. It was a multi-month project. I had, like I say, my machine. I think I did the initial implementation on my machine because it was so easy to use. I had my editor, I had my printer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got a listing of the operating system, and then piece by piece, just commenced to describe how it worked, how you interfaced with it, what the key variables were, how brief descriptions of how you might use it, and got that done and gave it to Atari, and then they took it and gave it to their documentation group. So they had tech writers internally who then took over that document and tried to make it what they perhaps more readable. I don't think I had a lot of errors in it, but perhaps it was a bit terse.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in fact, I have a recollection of, I worked primarily with one of the tech writers, and unfortunately I've forgotten his name. And there was a part of the document was describing a feature that was perhaps not easily understood. And we never did come to a resolution. He would rewrite that paragraph to be very easy to read in English, and indeed it was, but it was incorrect. He would be describing something other than what I was trying to describe, and so he and I went back and forth, I don't know how many times, before I finally just gave up and said, okay, what you have is quite readable, but inaccurate. And so that was one of the fails in there. But other than that, I think we worked through it. It took a long time for them to get involved with the rewrite, and of course then it was finally published along with the program listing and the hardware, the schematics and all kinds of timing diagrams.
Mm-hmm.
And, quite a large set of documents that went
Right.
out to developers.
Yeah, I'm familiar with those documents. I didn't know that you helped write them. That's awesome.
Right. Yeah. I like I say, I did the first draft, and then they went from there. And then when that was done, just big picture, I think the next thing was Pilot. Oh no, that's interesting. George Simcock may still have been around, because I think for the OS manual in it, but I got called to write Pilot. I was not very impressed with the language. My mind was in things like Pascal, I think, was what I thought was really the end-all language at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Structured and data hiding and hierarchies and things like that. I'm looking at Pilot. I'm seeing, do I really want to get involved with this? And it kind of really missed the point, right, of the ease of use and the power that it did contain for text matching and just writing simple interactive programs. But I had the chance also to do the turtle graphics. That was one of the thing was to start with the basic Pilot, common Pilot language, which had only, probably fewer than a dozen commands, and to add turtle graphics to it, to add sound generation,
Mm-hmm.
and to use the Atari peripherals, to add those in as well. So at that point, it began to sound, this is pretty interesting. The basic core language was fairly easy to implement, but then the turtle graphics had some challenges, and of course, just defining them. What is this new graphics extension going to look like? And as I recall, there were inputs. I would think I was working with Bob and or Ted Kahn at that point, and I think I had a discussion with David Thornburg. He was interested in turtle graphics and education.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg Yob, who was he was involved with the PCC in Menlo Park. And
Right.
I think he was maybe the most involved in kind of critiquing the extensions that I was making, and he had a lot of suggestions for what the language, what he thought what it should look like. But at this point now, we said, okay, we're not, now I've got sort of real graphic screen. I don't have like a 24 by 80 text screen. We've got real
Right.
pixels. We've got colors. This isn't going to be a repeat of WSFN. And so we say, yeah, well, this pilot is basically working with integer arithmetic. We can do degrees, 1 to 360 degree operations, plus and minus, and we have multiple colors, so we can select colors for the pen or the turtle, whatever we want to call it. And so we went from there, and spent quite a bit of time and had a lot of fun designing it and then implementing it and then testing it. And of course, the screen itself had multiple modes. You could have a mode where when the turtle went off, say the right-hand side of the screen, he would appear on the left-hand side. It would be like a wrapping mode. Another mode where it would bounce, so you'd have like a mirror reflection off of a wall. Another mode where he would disappear and wander around in this much larger graphic space, which was maybe plus or minus 32K, until if he happened to wander back on the screen again. And so we had those kinds of options, and got that done. Of course. What's that?
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I'm afraid I've lost my thread.
Oh, okay, sorry. You wrote, all the specifications for it. I've seen, sometimes I talk to people who did things at Atari and they just sort of winged it, and you didn't. You wrote all these specification documents for how the language was going to work, and there's the internal specification and the external specification, and those are all been scanned because you saved all that, and it just seemed extraordinarily well planned out, and then they made it cartridge, and that was a product that I assume did fairly well. Do you know?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I had privy to that. I know the company was they put a lot of resources on it. The manual that they did, the one that comes in the loose leaf binder, just a beautiful manual, introduction or primer. I don't remember what that was called, but they obviously they put a lot of money into that, and promotional money, and to get that out to the educators. And as far as how it went, I know that when it came out, there were articles about it, favorable articles in various educational publications. And I guess internally they were impressed enough with it that ultimately Bob and Ted Kahn were interested in extending that for the summer camp program.
Right, and I'd like to talk to you about that, because now you it was announced as either Super Pilot or Pilot 2, but never really released except for at the summer camp. And you, when we had our previous conversation, you knew it as Summer Camp Pilot. So I'm curious as to how that came about and why they wanted it, why they wanted more, and then if you know why it never was released except for to a few lucky kids at camp.
Well, I suspect that this the request came out of the summer camp program. That's Bob Kahn, right? Right, yeah. Yeah, so, not out of marketing. I suspect that maybe Pilot didn't generate the kind of revenues they were looking for, but that the summer camp, they saw that by making some improvements to it, they could enhance the experience of the kids in the summer camp. Mm-hmm. And so they came up with a list of, here's, starting with the existing Pilot, could you add this, and this? And I got kind of a checklist of things that they thought would really make it either easier to use or more powerful. And it was specifically, this is for our summer camp program, and that's how it was presented to me. And that's why I never knew it in any other framework. Mm-hmm. And so parts of it were obviously things that would be very easy for me to do because of knowing the existing program so well. Other parts were either major changes or things that I thought would be maybe not worth it, But there was another contract programmer involved with this name of Howie Franklin. And he was very eager to take on those parts. He was kind of championing, well, for one thing, the initial pilot was a source code level interpreter. So, and of course it had multiple modes. You could enter commands directly, just have them executed as you entered them, or you could enter them to create a program which would be executed later. And at all those levels, we rescanned the source code. Say, as opposed to BASIC. The Atari BASIC was tokenized. Mm-hmm. So you entered the source code, it got turned into tokens, and then when you did a printout or a display later on, the tokens were kind of reversed back to create the source code that had created them. Well, Howie Franklin had the idea that he was going to kind of do, I think, both. We had the source code. He was going to create tokens, which would allow it to execute much faster. So we wouldn't have to be doing all these searches to find the text string that matched this other text string that led you to know what the atom was. So I think he ended up storing both the original source code, and adding tokens. So when you printed it out, you got the original source code. And when you executed it, you executed off the tokens. So that was the kind of thing that he took on, and I did not really monitor closely what he did. So he did a lot of the work for Summer Camp Pilot, and kind of working independently. I think we kind of each took on our roles and merged the code together, worked off a common source code base, and that's what it was. And I really didn't pursue it as to, after that, although I did end up apparently with a complete listing, which somebody verified matched what had gone to the summer camp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you gave me the listing, and I photographed all of it and put it up on AtariAge, and some just intrepid person OCR'd the whole thing and got it to compile, and then made sure that the compilation matched what was distributed. So, complete source code.
I saw that. I was looking at that within the last couple of days. The fellow at Atari_Ace.
Yeah.
Looks like he did that for several of the files. Mm-hmm. The original Pilot, and then the Pilot 2, or Summer Camp Pilot, and I was just amazed that this was able to be done, that you could start with your photographs and do the OCR, and then it must have been a fairly tedious checking, because I looked at these programs, I can see the comments are there, and the code looks good, and just amazing feat.
Yes, indeed.
So,
yeah.
So I was amazed at the amount of interest there was, because in looking at that, I could also see that you've got a number of forums out there. Your Antic Podcast, AtariAge, Atari Mania, Atari Compendium, on and on. I'm sure that's just the major players. Those are the ones that come up with Google. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And all these people, and the interest in this low-level code and things like that, it just amazes me.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad that, the stuff that you and the others created, it was just an incredible legacy that changed a lot. Sometimes it was just like, oh yeah, I played games, it was fun, and wasn't that great? But I've talked to so many people who are just like, I learned about computers and whatever, that Atari 400 changed my life, and my entire career is because of that machine, or learning BASIC or Pilot or whatever it was, and so there are so many fond memories and just life changes because of it. So.
Yeah, but just this a while back, right? The Amoeba debugger kind of came up out of the blue, and you got all these people who decided they wanted to try it out, and here they are, whatever, single stepping or setting breakpoints.
Right. Yeah.
Amoeba. My gosh, it's know, on the one hand, you've got these monstrous programming systems like Windows and all iTunes or whatever, these megabytes of code, and then yet still people getting down there with the bits and the bytes, and that's wonderful.
Yeah. So apparently you did something with I know that was Amy's thing, but you wrote some memos about Amoeba at some point, according to your listing of memos. Do you recall anything about that?
Well, I don't. Amy and I were friends. We had a pretty tight group under Paul Lawton. I was there for probably about 4.5 years, and at one point we just had a really nice group, and everybody was friends. We'd go out to lunch together, and I was apparently monitoring just her progress. I guess I don't know if this was make sure she got the product done on time or what, but I did see that. What was that, 1982, 1983, over a period of about 4 months, that I was writing status reports on Amoeba, and I don't think I ever used it much, certainly not for programming development. I might have monitored it just for the standpoint of doing these status, but I think there were a lot of things I got assigned to just because I was willing to write. Manuals and specifications and things like that. A lot of people didn't, and as you pointed out, with regard to the external and the internal specifications for the original pilot, I enjoyed that. And of course, for me, it was part of the design process, and it is what I had kind of learned in the beginning. Going in was, you wrote specs. Because it kind of made things go faster if you knew what you were programming, if you knew what your goal was. And so you'd have, external specs, which would talk about behaviors, and then you had internal specs, which would talk about the implementation. What kind of data structures did you have, and how were they related to each other, and what were your key modules that you were going to be building this thing from, and that was all. I never felt comfortable with designing on the fly. You wanted to have the kind of thing down, get the approvals, see how things worked out, if it was self-consistent, and then go from there. And of course, I got some habits from the early days, which had to do with you debugged in your head. It wasn't sitting at the machine. Single stepping and doing breakpoints. You looked at, if you had a problem, you thought it out. Why is this happening? And make it into a thought experiment. And get down to working on the hardware kind of only as necessary. And that all falls back to the original how I learned, which was submitting a deck of cards and at the end of the day and picking up a listing the following morning. And you had all day to think about why it didn't work. And that was all you had. It was just thinking about why it didn't work, looking at the listing and figuring out what you were going to do the next day, that night, what changes you needed to make to get it to work. So it was very cerebral. And I noticed, as I got into it, that more and more people, the younger programmers, were very much interested in just being on the hardware. And, we don't need to think about this too much. We'll just kind of set a breakpoint or single step through it and see where it goes wrong. And so anyway, the specs were kind of, in line with the way that I learned programming.
Okay, cool. Should we move ahead and talk about, I think your next project was, you worked on DOS 3.
DOS 3, that would have been around 1981. So Atari decided that they really needed a more powerful disk operating system than the earlier ones. And this is all kind of vague, but I think they contracted this out. And I remember a key person at that time was named Jeff McKenna. And he was involved with the outside developer. But he and Paul Lawton and I had all had a fair amount of experience with disk operating systems, prior to Atari. And we're trying to bring in the things that we had seen and liked and knew you needed for a really commercial level disk operating system. And I think I wrote some specifications at that time. I'm pretty sure that I was appointed to give a presentation to Atari management on why this was why this needed to be funded. And I got the various inputs from people involved and made that presentation. And then I don't think I had much to do at all with the actual development. I think that was Jeff McKenna and some other people that he was associated with. So I know it probably took a fair amount of time, but that I don't have that much documentation on it, and it's pretty much gone. Another thing to mention is that while I was working at Atari, this was not my only client. I was still actively consulting with another number of companies while at Atari, and also went back to Santa Clara University to get a master's degree in computer science. So it was kind of late in the game, but this was kind of something I really wanted to do, primarily for myself. I don't think there was any economic payback. I was going to school several times a week, the early bird program. And so I had a lot of distractions going on during that time, and so I suspect that most of my involvement with DOS 3 would have been right up at the front, getting it specified, what it's going to be, what it's going to do. Mm-hmm. And then I think once that got done, I probably wasn't too involved.
Okay. And the next thing on your list is the Sweet 16 project.
Right, Sweet 16, what's that, 1200 XL.
Right.
Again, same group of people I'd been working with, the home computer division, Paul Lawton, still managing, and trying to get inputs from not exactly what did we do wrong with the 400, 800, but how can you make it better, cheaper, and but still compatible. That was the interesting part. In spite of all our nice, clean interfaces in the I/O section, with the I/O control blocks and the system calls, game developers and application developers being what they are, and having access to the source code, did what they wanted. Mm-hmm. And so there were some really... Initially, we thought, gee, maybe we'll just redo the operating system, and it became apparent, no, we can't do that, because then it won't be compatible with all the software that's out in the field, and they wanted that, all the cartridges and the floppy disks and all the stuff that ran on the 800, it should be running as well on the Sweet 16. So it was kind of a balancing act, and how to fit things in without moving anything. So there was data in there that people were accessing. There were subroutines. So somewhat limited on what they could do. And again, I think from the hardware standpoint, they were also looking in terms of manufacturability and cost improvements, and seemed to take quite a while for the rewrite, but I think the goals were met.
Mm-hmm.
And that was probably the last major thing I was involved with. And I think that also had to do with I was documenting and attending a certain number of the design meetings. Although, as a consultant, that's another interesting thing that happens when you're consulting there. You tend to not to go to as many meetings as if you're an employee. I guess for two reasons. One is you're out in the real world. We're talking with other companies, and a certain amount of information maybe they don't want a consultant to know. And then there's also the fact that, gee, we're paying you X dollars per hour, and we don't want you just sitting in this boring meeting. We'd rather have you out there doing some your consulting, and we'll inform you of the important parts. So as a result, I was there at Atari for 4.5 years, and did not get a whole lot of inside information. Like probably went to maybe one marketing meeting in the whole time I was there, and not a lot of the daily meetings, and so it'd be selective when I would be in there. So that may have been the last major project, the kind of things that saw the light of day.
Mm-hmm.
There was one more project I did just before I left in when was that, 83, was a project, I think Ken Balthaser was maybe managing this, and it had to do with speech, computer-generated speech.
Okay.
They were looking at a project that used the Votrax 1, and the control language was going to be something called World English. And I think it was kind of a phonetic language.
Okay.
And I wrote some specs for that, about how this was going. I think it was going to be a peripheral, and you just entered your text, and out came the speech. I don't remember there ever being a prototype built. I think that we probably they folded up the division before we ever got that far. So we have some specs for it, specifications, but at least for the software part, for the behavior. And I don't even know if the prototype was ever built. But that was kind of how it ended. I think I was involved in that about the time when I left, which would have been October of 83.
What brought your contract with Atari to an end? I mean, I realize everything started to fall apart right around October 1983. So,
well, I don't remember if I was let go or if I quit. But as I had said, I had other jobs going on outside, and I had a very attractive opportunity to get involved with a company working on a telephone switch.
Mm-hmm.
To be, they were developing it for ROLM, R-O-L-M, who was a big name in PBXs at that time. And it involved a Motorola chip, and it sounded really exciting. And so it may very well be that I just kind of eased myself out. But to tell you the truth, I don't remember.
Okay.
But it was an easy transition. Atari was going through major transitions, and this was a chance just to get involved in something new and exciting.
Right. All right. So when I visited you about this time last year, you handed me a big pile of source code and binders and things, and I that's all been scanned and it's online now. And I'm just curious, why did it get saved? Was it dumb luck, or was there some sense of this is going to be important one day, or what?
No, it's really I'm a pack rat, and I probably have the manual for every computer, mini computer, and microprocessor that I've ever written code for, and some that I haven't. And project, only painfully have I gotten rid of about half of the project documentation for things that were just little one-shots and never went anywhere. Mm-hmm. So I've got that part is natural, just to save this stuff, because it would be fun to look at it later. 20 years down the line, wouldn't it be neat to go over and look at the stuff again? So I did that, and of course, at a certain point, the Atari stuff I became aware that there was more interest in that than there would be in some of the other things I did. So I made it a point not to throw out anything relating to Atari. The other stuff I've kind of been slowly throwing out. But probably more native inclination than anything else.
Okay. Well, we're happy that you saved it. Thank you very much. What haven't we talked about the Atari days that we should have?
Atari, maybe R&D, Alan Kay.
Yeah, tell me.
So he came on to Atari, and I formed an R&D group, and of course I was quite well aware of him through his reputation, and in fact I had spoken with him on the phone once with regard to Smalltalk, and what was it, the Alto and the Diablo machines up at Xerox Park. Mm-hmm. I kind of got interested in that, and I'd actually called him because I had wanted to find out some information about how it was done. And of course, later on, a whole series of books were published about Smalltalk 80, right, by Addison Wesley. It was probably half a dozen books, which do describe, implementation details and all kinds of stuff, but about as far as I could get with Alan Kay on that conversation was, Smalltalk is programmed in Smalltalk, which is not unusual, right? There's C compilers that are written in C. Sure. But when you're talking about Smalltalk being written in Smalltalk, that really doesn't tell you anything about how the things worked. The data structures, and then either he didn't seem to want to get beyond that. Like, that was self-explanatory. Okay, so I left very frustrated, but then he came on to Atari. This was later on in time. When I had talked with him, he was still at Xerox, and so I was kind of excited. And I did get to meet with him, and he had seen some of the pilot stuff, my documentation. And I did get a chance to fly back on the corporate jet back to Cambridge for a conference that Atari was sponsoring about languages. I think Marvin Minsky was there, and a couple of other AI notables from back there. And it was very nice flying back on the corporate jet, I'll have to say. I did enjoy that, but we did not have a lot of contact. I think he did at one point want to know if I would be interested in transferring into the R&D group. And I don't remember what the time frame was, but I kind of sized it up, and although I considered that quite an honor to be asked to do that, I looked at what my interests were, my capabilities, and looking at the people who were already in R&D, pretty academic, a lot of academic types, PhDs and that. And I said, this is really going to work out better if I stay where I am. And so I declined that offer, didn't pursue that at all. And it worked out well, because I really did enjoy the time at Atari. We did a lot of interesting things there, and a lot of what I did saw the light of day, which is nice. Not all of it. And
nice.
Good experience.
Good. So if you could send a message to the Atari computer users who still exist, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, you tell them I am amazed at the level of interest, at the depth of interest in this stuff, and at the time, nowhere, would not have thought that it would still be, that interest would be there today. So all I can say is have fun. It looks like you've got a number of dedicated people really getting the information out there. That have fun.
Awesome. Thank you, Harry.
You bet.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, there are two ways you can help. You can help fund these interviews directly by contributing to my Patreon. A small monthly contribution will help offset the expenses of making these oral history interviews. Contribute at patreon.com/Savitz. Or make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.